Hello, everyone. We're here in Topchubashov Center, continue our Top Talk video series on geopolitical developments in the post-Soviet region. Today's topic is a recent protest in Kazakhstan, and our guest is Luca Anceschi, Professor of Eurasian Studies at the University of Glasgow. Professor Anceschi's research focuses especially on Central Asian affairs, and in his latest book, Analyzing Kazakhstan's Foreign Policy, Regime, Neo-Eurasianism in the Nazarbayev Era, he explains in detail the role of Eurasianist ideas in the Kazakhstani foreign policy in the last decades. Professor Anceschi, thank you for accepting our invitation and joining our program.
It's good to see you, Mohammed.
And Professor, in Kazakhstan, we see life is gradually returning to relative normal, especially after a series of protests in different parts of the country last week. But there are some still lingering questions about the kind of unexpectedness of the scale of events and the regime's reaction to the protests. So what's your take on the sudden turn of events in Kazakhstan, especially in the context of changing power dynamics within the neo-patrimonial regime, namely between Nazarbayev and Tokayev? And what kind of changes and continuities we may see in the Kazakhstani foreign policy in the near future?
I think that we need to focus on the unexpectedness first. And the protests were not unexpected. I mean, they were unprecedented by size and by geographical diffusion across the country, but they were unexpected. In fact, there is a tradition of people going to the streets in smaller groups, obviously not always at the same time, in all the cities in the last 2 or 3 years. In fact, the Tokayev presidency started with protests in the urban centers against the decision of the regime to orchestrate transition rather than asking the people who the president would be. So also the dramatic decline of the economic performance of Kazakhstan in the last 5 to 6 years is something that has brought people on the streets more regularly, more often, in the next few years. So I would say that the elements for the eruption of some larger scale protests were all there, despite the lack of a generally strong and organized opposition. Kazakhstani opposition is very much fragmented. There are a few groups here and there, mostly in urban centers. Some of them revolve around figures that are not really clear what they do, at least in the past. So you couldn't call the kind of movement that we saw as a kind of organized opposition. It was much more spontaneous, and the spontaneousness of the movement was ignited by the latter element in economic mismanagement, which is the rise of oil prices. Then what was also unexpected was the fact that the protest actually became a very comfortable smokescreen for some kind of elite politics played out violently in the street. So what happened after the violence erupted across Kazakhstan, but particularly in Almaty, well, almost exclusively in Almaty, is that we are not sure, but we could say that there were fragments of the elite who would have liked to destabilize the country and force a leadership change. Obviously, there is no evidence of that yet, not conclusive evidence, but there are a lot of elements that let us think about it. First of all, we don't know who the violent people are. We don't know why the police disappeared from the street, and we don't know what kind of relationship, if there is one, and I think there is, exists between the eruption of violence, the lack of control by the police, and the substitution of, well, actually the arrest of Karim Asimov, who is the very powerful man in the Kazakhstani politics. So that's also unexpected. And then we have the third element, which is part to this unprecedented nature of the Kazakhstani crisis is that the fact that solution came once support was extended by the Russian Federation and the other CSTO states. So this three elements of protest, violence, and foreign intervention is what make this crisis a unique development in Kazakhstani politics. Now, second part of your question, Mohammed, is this going to be delivery continuity or change? Well, I think it's going to be a bit of both, because the change is that we are now entering the proper Tokayev era. So the power system, power structure that we are seeing erected in Kazakhstan in the last, from now on, is something that revolves mostly around the figure of Tokayev. This is no longer a kind of collective regime, Nazarbayev, Massimov, Tokayev. This is no longer the Nazarbayev family. This is becoming something much more closely aligned to the president and his vision. So I would say that that's the kind of significant change. To address this change, though, you will need to have continuity, because the regime is going to be very much inward-looking, looking at itself, its own priorities, and especially if the Nazarbayev family is going to be ousted and marginalized from the Kazakhstani power system, you are going to see a lot of asset redistribution going on. And
it has already started.
To deliver on a kind of redistribution, you will have to actually have continuity also in the way in which you treat the population demands, so ignoring them again. And I think that the persistence of authoritarianism and repression is another signal of continuity in Kazakhstan.
Yes. And my second question is about what we call authoritarian learning in the region, and especially in the case of Russian President Vladimir Putin, imitating Nazarbayev and creating a similar system, leading from behind. And what do you think? What kind of implications will it have for the regime succession in the region?
Well, I would say that the system that Kazakhstan sort of tested didn't work. I mean, we saw this week the failure of orchestrating transition 3 years ago. Having this kind of tandem in power, whereas you didn't know what Nazarbayev was controlling and what Tokayev was doing, didn't really work, because obviously this kind of uncertainty about who really calls the shot created clashing interests within the elite. So I wouldn't really say that as a model, as a blueprint for a place like Russia or Belarus, this kind of system actually worked. My idea, and it's something which I researched on, is much more that something like the Uzbek system could have worked, in which you probably leave the president dying in power if his control is strong enough, and you deal with the transition later on. This is something which I feel more confident with this to be replicated. Also, like the Uzbek system copied the Turkmen system, but now we probably hear that Turkmenistan is going to have a father to son transition, like the one in Azerbaijan. So you see, I would say that if there is one big lesson to learn from us, for us and for the leaders, that is that this Kazakhstani transition system has not worked. Has not worked maybe because Tokayev was not a strong enough person, because the people who call the shots prefer to stay in the back and not being seen as protagonists of the power system. But this kind of transition was protracted in time, carefully orchestrated, actually collapsed last week, quite spectacularly, if you ask me. So if there is a lesson to be learned, and we've seen that these authoritarian leaders do copy each other quite a bit, that's something which we will see.
Yes. And about Russia, and as in the other policy issues related with Russia, here too experts were divided mainly into two main camps. As we say in Russian studies, when something happens, one group argues that it is Russia trying to resuscitate the Soviet Union in its former borders and imperial power, and the other group said that no, it was Russia is like just reacting. Yeah, and the case of Kazakhstan, it was like one group saying, again, Russia, it's like creating a new like Soviet Union-like entity. Russia is like acting in an imperial manner. Another group was saying that no, Russia's deployment of troops to Kazakhstan is just a diverting its attention and resources away from more important Ukraine front. Yes. So, what do you think? Where does Russia stand in the events in Kazakhstan, and how Russia's involvement as part of the CSTO deployment to the Kazakhstan would influence ethnic Kazakhs' attitude toward the Russian, I mean, like ethnic Russian population of the Kazakhstan in the future? I mean, at least they are 23% of the Kazakhstan's population, yeah. And how would influence their attitude toward Russians?
Well, I think that there are two answers, actually. The first part of the question relates to how I understand the role that Russia played. And I would say that Russia could only get advantage and benefits by the situation, because it wasn't an invasion, it wasn't any kind of imperial outreach or geopolitical advantage. I mean, they got called in pretty much as the referee into an intra-regime quarrel. So they were called in because the Kazakhstani regime could not get their act together. And to my mind, the size, the very limited size, 2,500, 2,000 people sent by Russia into Kazakhstan, but also the time frame, I think that they're going to leave very soon. Today is what, the 13th of January.
Yes.
So you're going to see a very small mission being withdrawn after a week or so. Well, that tells you that it wasn't really an invasion or some kind of imperial overreach. This is Russia being called in to support Tokayev, signaling to the part of the Kazakhstani elite who did not want Tokayev that really you do have this person who has got the backing of Putin. So that's how I see it. This doesn't mean, though, that the consequences are not significant. Actually, are very significant, because on the one hand, you, if you want to make again the political science argument here, you see that now having any kind of democratic or liberalizing measure introduced when it comes after protests is going to be very difficult across the region, because they can always call Russia. And that's something which is very significant. I don't think that having the Russians, well, having the mission coming and gone influences Kazakhstan's sovereignty, because again, you're not going to have Russia occupying forces. But I do think that reduces very significantly the room for maneuver that Kazakhstan has, especially in terms of foreign policy. Okay, so you do have a Kazakhstan which will be less multilateral, if you want, Mohammed. So kind of less able to do whatever they want in foreign policy, less able maybe even to be reluctant to integrate more within the Eurasian Union. I actually am not looking to my research at the domestic population, you know, the Russian, it's not something that I work on, but I would say that a big test of seeing whether or not the Russian influence gathered through the mission, because there were always a Russian influence in Central Asia. I mean, that's what I never understood, where people would say that. Russian influence in Central Asia remained strong, even when it was actually declining. So I don't think this Russian influence was kind of disappearing, but now the first test about to see whether or not there is a kind of influence play from the outside is the reform on the alphabet. If there is some kind of ultimate cancellation or significant postponement of the Latinization of the Kazakhstani language, you could understand that that could be a problem. I mean, especially if you hear Putin say other things. But I don't really think that you're going to see a Kazakhstan which is now being controlled by Russia significantly. But certainly, there are the two main impacts are one about the wider message that they send to the rest of Eurasia is that, well, we are in charge. You're not going to be able to have a revolution here, not at least not one that Russia supports. And on the other hand, is that, well, you will see more closely what kind of, well, a much less multilateral policy led by Kazakhstan.
And then lastly, and relatedly, if we are talking about Russian influence on Kazakhstan, we should touch upon Chinese also reaction to the events in Kazakhstan, and they mostly kind of supported Russian and CSTO mission in Kazakhstan, and that's expectedly arose some questions about, again, is Russian and Chinese interests on the Central Asia and specifically in Kazakhstan diverging, yes, and the traditional argument is on Central Asia, Russia is the security provider and China like economic powerhouse, and that's somehow complementary. And do you agree with this argument, and especially in the context of the recent developments in Kazakhstan?
Yes, I would say that there isn't a significant impact on what we've seen going on in Kazakhstan onto the way in which China-Kazakhstan relations will be developed from now on. Use the right word. Russia's interests and Chinese interests in Kazakhstan are complementary, or at least not immediately clashing. Also, to the same extent to which China does not have the same kind of intention to intervene militarily in whatever conflict happens in Kazakhstan, Russia does not have China's economic power. So it seems to me that you're going to be seeing in that area the same again. And even though I expected, I was saying before, Kazakhstan foreign policy to be less multidirectional from now on, I still see that Kazakhstan will sell a lot of oil and gas to China. So in this kind of situation, the policy of playing different great powers at the same time is going to be staying because it's too convenient for Kazakhstan.
Yes, Professor Anceschi, thank you very much for the interview, and we hope that we'll see you in our program soon again.
Thank you very much.